Now we're going to talk about something called age range correlation and age overlap correlation. These sorts of analyses have been around for a while. Age overlap correlation is just literally the same thing as age range correlation, but just on different data. Um, yeah, there have been various versions of this, but the way that it's implemented in the EM tools owes the most to the Bearcliff and Vogler and Fitzpatrick and Torelli's sort of approach to this. So this is a way of kind of analyzing the overlap between species ranges in the context of phylogeny and comparing that to a given null hypothesis. And so this is originally used pretty much to sort of estimate the geography of speciation, like how much of speciation was sympatric versus fully allopatric, etc. And so the idea here is, let's say you've got allopatric speciation. So you've got this species of frogs, and some vicariance event happens that splits them in two, or you've got some long distance dispersal to a new habitat, and then over time, these two separate populations kind of evolve to be different. And so you've got this speciation event here, over which your red frog eventually turns green, and then possibly with further evolution, maybe initially they sort of exclude each other based on ecological interactions, but they develop eventually enough differences that that signal of the allopatric speciation event is kind of erased, and the green frogs may to some extent invade the red frog's range and vice versa. And so that's one scenario. So this vicariance followed by secondary range overlap. And then we sort of contrast that with the scenario where you kind of get sympatric speciation, or even partially sympatric speciation, where instead of having the population split in two, you sort of get a new frog arising, overlapping to a large extent the whole time with where the red frog is. So there isn't that period of initial allopatry followed by secondary range overlap. So this is what age range correlation is intended to do, is to essentially look at the relationship between how species ranges overlap with each other and how the age of those clades, what the age of those clades is. So basically, what you do is you have, for every pair of species ranges, you calculate how much they overlap. And the way you do that is you take the area of A intersect B and divide that by the minimum area of A or B. So this is the area of A intersect B, so the area where the ranges overlap. And then the smaller area of A's and B's ranges would be A's range, right? And so what you're going to do is you're going to divide this region of overlap, the area of that, however many square kilometers or whatever, by the area of this species range. And so what that gives you is the percentage of the smaller species range that is overlapped by the larger, which in this case would be about 80%. So if this was like a little clade of 4 species, you would do that for every pair. And so you'd see that the overlap between A and B is about 80%. The overlap between A and C is 0, so that's the blue and the orange. A and D, also 0. Overlap between C and B is about 0.2, so that's this chunk of the range divided by this species range. So about 20% of its range overlaps with green, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, now the question is, how do you map those onto a phylogeny? Well, the logic here is actually pretty straightforward. So the overlap between A and B is just the overlap between A and B, right? Well, what do you do about the overlap between, so there is a common ancestor here, between that was A and B's ancestor. What do you say about the overlap between C and the common ancestor of A and B? Well, the way this works is they have this sort of topological averaging thing going on. So you say the overlap between C and clade AB is half driven by the overlap of C and B and half driven by the overlap of C and A. So that means the overlap across this node is half of CB's overlap plus half of CA's overlap. So there'll be half of 0.2 plus half of 0. So that comes out to be 0.1. And then D, it would be half of D's overlap with C and then a quarter of D's overlap with B, and a quarter of D's overlap with A. So the logic here is that the overlap between D and this clade goes this ancestor here, this branch, and half of that's going to be driven by this side of the branch, half that's going to be driven by this side of the branch, so half of it is C, and then half of it is AB. But then half of AB is A, half of AB is B, right? And so the idea is you take a half of this overlap, and a quarter of this overlap, and a quarter of this overlap. But in this case, all of those are 0, so that's, yeah. It just comes out to be 0. All right, so that allows you to make a plot like this, hold on a second, where you actually have clade age and range overlap, average range overlap. But how do you sort of test that against a null hypothesis, right? You've got your tree, you've got your range overlaps, and you want to basically see, is the relationship here more or less, is the slope more or less than you expect by chance? Is the intercept more or less than you expect by chance? Etc. And so the way you do that is not by just doing a linear regression. So the issue here, despite this figure, the issue here is there's a lack of independence between a lot of these range overlaps, because you see here from our example, A's range goes into calculating this and this and this. And so this has a certain age and a certain overlap, and this has a certain age and a certain overlap, and this has a certain age and certain overlap, and those are not independent observations, not entirely, because A's range and B's range are included in all of these. C's range is included in this one and this one, and D's range is only included in this one. So you cannot assume, as you typically do with a linear regression, you cannot assume that all of these observations are fully independent of each other. That means we can't just do a linear model and say, significant slope and intercept, because the assumptions of that linear model are not met. The points are not independent, and they probably aren't identically distributed. But we don't give up, right? We go back to our good old Monte Carlo test. So basically, we use the fact that these are not independent. We use the fact that phylogeny induces dependence here to actually build Monte Carlo replicates. And the way we do that is we take our species empirical ranges, we calculate our overlaps on the real tree, and that gives us our empirical observation. But then we randomize the identity of tree tips, and we do that again. So we calculate the average overlaps across this tree, and we get a relationship between clade age and overlap for this randomized tree, and then for this randomized tree, and we just do it over and over and over again, and we get a series essentially of slopes and intercepts under the null hypothesis that there's no relationship between a clade age and range overlap, right? And so we're doing something very much like the null hypothesis under linear regression, but that takes into account the correlation induced by the topology of the tree, right? And so we have, this will be one of these slopes and intercepts, and this will be another one of these slopes and intercepts, and this will be another one. And so we compare our empirical slope and intercept. Here's a real analysis. We compare our empirical slope and intercept to a distribution, that's these gray lines here, of slopes and intercepts under the null hypothesis that there is no relationship between age and overlap that isn't induced by the topology of the tree. And so that allows us to get p-values for whether or not our intercept or our slope exceed what you would expect, or more or less than you would expect, based on that null hypothesis there's no relationship. So that's cool, right? It allows you to do a linear regression-ish thing of range overlap as a function of node age across the entire phylogeny. And this is obviously there's 6 nodes on this tree, so this is not a lot. We usually want to use bigger trees than that. But what is age overlap correlation? It's literally the exact same thing, except that we calculate niche overlap or some other sort of overlap, and then do the same randomization test. So this could be niche models in geographic space. It could be niche models in environment space. It could be distance between centroids in environment space. It could be actually resource utilization histograms, so like overlap between resource utilization histograms. Basically, any metric, any measurement on a group of species that results in a distance matrix or overlap matrix, you could technically use this way. I mean, arguably for distance matrices, you could use a Mantell test, but this is something that you can use for overlap matrices too. So basically, same thing, except that our input data is just overlap in environment space or overlap of niche models in geographic space. But it's still the same sort of thing where you just try to, your empirical overlaps, you average them at the internal nodes in the tree, you do a regression on the relationship between node age and average overlap, and then you compare that to a null distribution. And you say, in this case, there is more overlap between closely related species, so shallow in the tree. There's more overlap than you'd expect by chance. The intercept is higher than expected. But there's a significant tendency towards declining overlap as you get deeper in the tree, right? So closely related things are more similar, more distantly related things are less similar, which is quite interesting. All right. And that's age range correlation and age overlap correlation. They're very useful analyses, and they're utilized some, but I honestly think they're sort of underemployed. They do some cool stuff, and there's there's some cool papers on this stuff. So the Fitzpatrick and Torelli, Barraclough, Mogler, Marcel Cardillo and I had one. Dina Grossenbacher has a paper where they sort of demonstrate via some simulations that this whole procedure actually seems to work pretty well, which is certainly reassuring. But I hardly urge you to check it out. It's very cool.